Welcome back to Task F, now in the FOI series. First things first, techniques of flight instruction. Why do we cover this? We already talked about how to teach. We already talked about how to learn. We cover the techniques of flight instruction because this is specifically talking about flight instruction, not just teaching, not just learning. And there's plenty of barriers that are specific to flight instruction, as well as other specific topics that we would need to cover. So, let's get into it. Number one, obstacles to learning. Well, in flight instruction, not everything goes smoothly. We already talked about barriers to effective communication earlier. We already talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If needs aren't met, people can't learn. Well, here's other obstacles to learning. The way to remember these is WIPA UA, or however you want to say it. WIPA-UA. The first letter here is worry, or lack of interest. If our student is so tremendously worried about showing up for their lessons, they might not learn so well. They might have some issues with it. It might take them 30 minutes of our hour flight to finally get comfortable and stop worrying. That's 30 minutes wasted as far as I'm concerned. So we want to make sure that our students aren't worried to show up for their lessons. Likewise, if someone is forcing them to fly, they're not going to learn. They have a lack of interest in the topic. And the same thing goes with parents teaching their kids music lessons and other types of academics that are, extracurricular. I used to be a tutor back in high school, and I'd have plenty of kids whose parents would be making them take Spanish class, or their parents would be making them take a special higher level math that they're just not interested in. And as a result, they didn't learn. I barely speak Spanish as it is, alright? So giving these kids Spanish lessons was, oh God, that was awful. Awful all around. Would not recommend. Be fluent in the language you want to teach. Word of the wise. Next one here is impatience. Students who are impatient are going to have difficulties learning. Now, we talked about this earlier. Students who are impatient tend to view the big goal rather than the small goals that lead up to it, and they don't make the connection that the small goals are what brings them to their goal at the end of the road. So, we give them small goals and really work on getting them set on these to help them bypass this issue. Next one here is going to be physical discomfort. I say physical. So, again, the plane is a pretty rough environment to be in for the most part, especially if you're in the South during the summer. It gets hot, it gets humid and gross in there, it gets smelly, it gets bumpy, there's thermals, it's loud. It's not the best place to be. So, we're trying to do most of our learning on the ground, where we don't have these interferences, these physical discomforts, we'll say. In addition, students can just straight up come in and be fatigued, or really tired, or hungry, or thirsty. All of these things, like we talked about, are going to be barriers to learning. Next is going to be anxiety. So, anxiety is a worry about an event in the future whose outcome or which outcome is not certain. So, worry is just pure worry. They could be worried about a multitude of things. Anxiety typically has to do with the outcome of a lesson. A student is anxious. They're trying to pass it. They're not sure if they're going to pass it. They're anxious about this assessment. That would be anxiety. Now, students who can handle this are fine. Some students can't handle anxiety. All they see is that anxiety and nothing else. And so they can't learn. Next barrier is a feeling of unfair treatment. First things first, treat everyone equally, right? Just do that to begin with. Now, some students, even if you are treating everyone equally, don't feel that way. Thus, why we call this a feeling of unfair treatment. The best thing you can do, honestly, is just sit down with the student and work with them. Maybe there's something psychologically underlying that makes them feel that way. An inferiority complex, maybe. But we want to make sure that every student feels like they're being given the same treatment by their instructor. And finally, apathy due to inadequate instruction. So oftentimes, students will just kind of become apathetic and detached and nonchalant once their instructor stops showing interest. So once again, as we talked about before with that professionalism, bring that demeanor, right? Bring that demeanor, that happiness, that willingness to work with people, that want to help people and instruct. Don't let your student become apathetic, because in my opinion, that is the worst of this list right here. It is the easiest thing that you can fix right off the bat. And honestly, there's no excuse. There is zero excuse to let your student become apathetic because you're treating them like, a bag of money, So, these are the obstacles to learning. Let's talk about different ways we can teach. Now, we already talked about different, what's I'm looking for here? Delivery methods of teaching. And since we talked about that, what you look at that? Demonstration performance has come back once more. So again, let's just do a quick review. EDZ, demonstration performance. We explain, instructor demonstrates, just write it out. Student does, instructor supervises, and then, there we go, we evaluate. Instructor evaluates. So, this is demonstration performance. In my opinion, I love this. I really think it's the best thing you can possibly do for a student. I know people whose instructors have straight up told them, hey, let's do slow flight, and they don't demonstrate it, and they just tell the student, yeah, put us in slow flight. It's pretty difficult to do right off the bat without, seeing it, feeling it, figuring it out. So yeah, this is, I think, one of the most important ways you can properly teach a student, and making sure that the point gets across. Demonstration performance. Monkey see, monkey do. So, in this demonstration performance method, we'll note that we see that the instructor does and the student does. When this happens, we have to exchange the controls from one set of hands to the next. And to do this, we use what we call a positive exchange of controls. So a positive exchange of controls is a 3-step process. The first step is when someone says that you have the flight controls. Let's say I'm flying with you, and I'm controlling the plane. I say, all right, that was good. You have the flight controls. You will then respond and say, I have the flight controls. I will then say one more time, you have the flight controls, and I'll put my hands up and visually indicate that I am not touching the controls at this point. A positive exchange of controls is so incredibly important, because if we don't know who is flying the plane at that time, we don't know who is going to take action if there's an emergency. If there is a collision risk with another aircraft, the FAA has found that it takes about 12 seconds from noticing an aircraft to taking action to avoid a collision. And if any of those 12 seconds is wasted in trying to figure out who's actually taking action, it's going to be a heck of a lot longer than 12 and a half seconds. So we need to make sure that we understand who is flying the plane. Now, in flight instruction, I'm sure we've all experienced it. I dropped my pencil. Can you go get it for me? Distractions. It's the classic one, is the pencil. But it's important. As much as we like to joke about it, the vast majority of stall and spin accidents have occurred not because a student just made a mistake, but because they were distracted from flying the aircraft. We incorporate distractions into our lessons because they allow us to test a student's multitasking ability. Not every single flight is going to be sterile. There's plenty of distractions that can pop up in a flight. Let's say they're flying their family and they've got a baby in the back. Some cargo moves around that they improperly secured. We've got a water spillage. We brought a water bottle and we spilled it. Or the classic, I dropped my pencil. Any of these, straight off the top of the head, are immediate common distractions that can happen to literally anyone. And if our student isn't able to deal with the distraction as they fly the plane, they're not ready to be a pilot. So as instructors, it's definitely important to make sure that we incorporate distractions into our flight instruction. Now, along with that, we incorporate what we call integrated flight instruction. So integrated flight instruction, let's see if I can draw how this will look here. And then we'll say like it's a GPS and a transponder and like a little ELT, but I don't know. There's our cockpit. I hope this works. Let's see. And we got like a blue sky up here. And we got the green grass down here. Oh, that's actually maybe not good. Whatever. Integrated flight instruction. This is going to be when we have our students looking both inside and outside the plane. Now, first thing we want to make sure we introduce with integrated flight instruction is going to be outside references. We teach our students how to perform maneuvers and fly the aircraft solely with outside visual references. That's going to start with reference to the horizon, picking maybe, bug splatters on the windshield, lining them up with the horizon, or whatever we have to do to make sure that our student is flying with outside visual references. Then we introduce our instruments. We use these guys to back up what's going on out here. Make sure what our eyes are seeing out here is correct based on this. Now, we do this because A, we want to make sure that we don't have our students develop a reliance on their instruments. Instruments can fail. If you're going up in a perfect Kavu day, your VFR sight really doesn't fail. So, that being said, we still talk about flight with instruments and basic maneuvers in our private because, this can go away. But for the most part, exterior, then interior. We find that students who actually follow an integrated flight instruction tend to be better at mastering their flight technique, and they become more precise with their climbs, their headings, and other performance aspects of the aircraft. Now, of course, this external sight picture helps with see and avoid. Because if I have a plane, did I really just draw it like that? That's pretty sad. Okay, it's a huge detail, sure. If you've got a plane out in the sight, we're going to see it a lot sooner out front than if our eyes are solely on our instruments. So, integrated flight instruction helps improve student ability, helps improve student accuracy, and of course helps with collision avoidance. Now let's talk about assessment of piloting technique. Now we talked about this before in instructor responsibilities and professionalism. We want to make sure that we assess our students properly, fairly, honestly, straightforward, keep them in the loop, that kind of thing. Every flight should have some sort of assessment in it. You shouldn't leave a flight with a student not knowing where the next thing is, or whether we have to do the flight again. So make sure that the student demonstrates ability based on the standards that you've set, whether that's PTS or ACS standards, or simply personal standards. Of course, we also want to make sure the student demonstrates this ability to us, doesn't just say they can do it. And after the flight, keep your student up to date. Give them a debriefing. Don't just let them go home. Give them a debriefing. Let's, go over the events of the flight, right? Replay, reconstruct, reflect, redirect. Go over how the flight went. And of course, we want to correct our students in this process. Now, after the fact, obviously we're telling our students what to do, but if a student is about to make a mistake in the plane, let them do it. Of course, within reason. We don't want to let them do something that's going to endanger us or others around us, but if a student's going to make a mistake that you think they're going to catch, let them do it. The best way to learn from mistakes, in my opinion, is from experience. So let them make an error and let them correct it. And once again, as instructors, it's our job to make sure that our students are prepared for the practical test and the endorsements. We have to assess them and certify that they've already met the abilities of the ACS or PTS. So do that. Make sure they're ready. Now, finally, in our techniques of flight instruction, it's important to introduce aeronautical decision making, or ADM. Now, what is ADM? ADM is a systematic approach to how pilots will determine the best course of action given a set of circumstances. So aeronautical decision making is how pilots can determine the course of action they need to take given the circumstances. The process for ADM is as follows. We define a problem, we choose a course of action, and then we implement our decision. We define the problem, we're too low. We choose what to do, let's add full power and climb, and we implement it by actually reaching down to the throttle, putting in full throttle, and pulling back on the yoke, and giving it a climb. That is the aeronautical decision-making process. And going through this with our students, maybe that's a simple example that I gave, but following through this with students is super important, because if you don't know what your problem is, you definitely don't know how to solve it. So the first step, no matter what you do, is always, hey, something is wrong. Let's define the problem and see what we can do to remedy it. With that, we also want to make sure that we have students utilizing all available resources to them, whether that's internal or external resources. Internal resources are going to be your wit, your knowledge, and your problem-solving ability. I'm just going to say it like that because I'm sure you can already see I can't write for my life. External, it's going to be something like ATC, or your charts, maybe your flight computer. All of these things, when we utilize internal and external resources together, we get good aeronautical decision making. Make sure we use all available resources when we start trying to find solutions to our problems. If you don't do that, shoot, you're only running on half cylinders, right? You got a 6-cylinder engine only running on 3. I don't know about you, I paid for all 6. I'm going to use all 6. So, we've discussed aeronautical decision making, processes, resources to use. We talked about assessment of piloting ability. Again, this is a responsibility of flight instruction. We talked about this previously. Integrated flight instruction, specifically how it will help our students. Incorporating distractions, improving their multitasking abilities and real-world experience. Maintaining a sterile cockpit. We actually didn't discuss that, so we'll get right back on that in a quick sec. We talked about positive exchange of controls, demonstration performance method, and obstacles to learning. Let's get on sterile cockpit real quick. Maintaining a sterile cockpit is hugely important in all critical phases of flight. A critical phase of flight is basically any time you are below 10,000 feet AGL. So, climb, descent, and except cruise. Sorry, let me add that on there. Except cruise, since all of us cruise super low. Right? Below 10,000 feet, except for cruise. So, sterile cockpit means no distractions, no speaking, nothing to distract the pilot from the pilot's job. The pilot's job is to fly the plane. So as much as it's really fun to talk with your students and work with them, talk on the ground. If it has nothing to do with education, keep it restrained for non-flying operations. And again, you never stop flying the plane until you walk away from it after it's been tied up. So making sure we keep distractions to an absolute minimum is super, super important to optimize and improve our flight instructing abilities. Now, I've covered everything in Task F. We've gone through it all, including our sterile cockpit. I hope that was helpful for you going through Task F. And after this, it looks like we've just got G remaining, and I am free to go. So I'll catch you in the next one, and see you in a sec.